Thank you for being here for our reading of the book of Esther. I did print out a PowerPoint sort of handout sheet. Before we begin, I just wanted to point out a couple things. Esther is one of the, let's say, forgotten books of the Bible for Christians. It is one of those books that is easy to overlook if your primary way of engaging the church is worship on Sunday mornings, because Esther is reserved for one alternate reading over the course of 3 years. So you may or may not hear Esther once every 3 years in worship, and you hear two small pieces of a larger story. And so this is the sort of story, to me, it's too good and it's actually too important for us to ignore. At the bottom, at that first page, I've included a number of pieces of art, because one of the things that we're going to do with this particular reading, with this particular translation that I'll talk about in a minute, in the Western world, we have turned Esther into somebody who is European. You can see from all those pictures, there is one picture in which Esther does not resemble somebody from the Western Hemisphere. And so we have brought Esther's story, when we use it, into our context, and in doing so, we lose some of the flavor of the story. We lose some of the intentions.
Okay, question.
Yeah.
Which of those pictures is not Western? Because I wasn't an art major.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. The bottom right, it's a little bit small.
Okay.
It is it's a Jewish artwork.
Okay. Thank you.
Which, if you look closely, Esther is in the center, and over her right shoulder to our left is her foster father, Mordecai,
Okay.
and he is wearing a turban.
Got it.
And so that is actually something I'll be talking about in a minute too,
Okay.
which is talking about that flavor of the story. If you turn to the next page, why bother with Esther? It's kind of a strange book to pick out of all the canon. In fact, Martin Luther said he didn't want it in the canon. He said it was too Jewish. It Judaizes too much. Because Luther had a very specific way of reading the Bible, law and gospel, and he did not find that dynamic in the book of Esther. So he called it too Jewish. But in a sense, I think that's exactly why we need to keep it. That's exactly why we need to hear it. We need to have other voices in the Scripture. We need to preserve the fact that Scripture does not neatly fit into all of our ideas about, what we should expect to find in the stories of God. And so, too Jewish, that's good. It's good to remember that this is a Jewish story. We have lots of stories of the Hebrew people, of the Jewish people, and we should engage those just as much as we engage stories about the good news of Jesus. So Esther stretches our ideas about what is biblical. In the times that I have encountered Esther in church, it's usually a women's Bible study, something on biblical womanhood and so on. And I'm not going to say those are bad things, but I will say that is limiting in a church. As a male, I have never been a part of a study where somebody said, you know what, we're going to do Esther. It is simply something that's been, it's been reserved for one part of the church, but not the rest. And I think it has a lot to say to all of us. And so as I mentioned, Esther is usually heard 0 times in 3 years. If you're lucky, you hear it 1 time, and that's if you attend church every Sunday for 3 years. But going on to the next panel, there is plenty of good news in Esther. Even as Lutherans, when Luther complained that he didn't find law and gospel in Esther. I'm not going to slander Martin Luther, but I don't think that he looked hard enough, because there's lots of good news. And in fact, over the next 4 Sundays, in both worship and in forums, I'm going to open up some discussion about some of those places where we find good news. The fact that Esther and Mordecai live in exile. There is good news about living in exile. It might not sound like it, but there is. This book contains good news about the authority of God, the sovereignty of God, even if God is never actually directly mentioned. It contains good news about the joy of living. This book it can be a very funny book. Sometimes we need to read it several times or go behind the English to find some of the wordplay. But it can be a very funny book. And so it reveals something about how we treat the Bible seriously, but sometimes the Bible is too important to take seriously. And Esther helps draw us out of that mentality. And finally, there is good news about hope for people who are feeling hopeless. That's the good news that Martin Luther missed, that I push back against the most. This is a story about fear and joy. This is a story about condemnation and redemption. There is a lot for us to take out of this story. I know I'm talking a lot, and I'm going to talk even more, but if you have a question, just raise your hand or just shout out. I do want to give you just a little bit of background on Esther. You'll find out in the story pretty quickly that everything centers on a Persian city called Susa. And we believe that the book was actually written in Susa, which would explain knowledge of some of the workings of the area, would explain how somebody knows how the first Persian Empire built its palace complex, how there was a city and a fortress. That leads us to believe that this was actually written by a Jewish person in exile in Persia. It was written down in about the 4th century before Jesus, and nowadays it describes the origin of a Jewish holiday called Purim, or as one of my Orthodox Jewish friends calls it, Jewish Halloween, because it is a time of celebration. As we get into the story, you will find a hero and an arch villain. And so one of the commands the rabbis made is that you are to celebrate in a feast the way that they do until you cannot tell the villain from the hero, until you cannot tell good and evil, because the idea was to celebrate. The same friend said that basically all Jewish holidays boil down to, they tried to kill us, they didn't, now let's celebrate. And so Purim highlights this particular story, but originally scholars think it didn't. Originally scholars think that this story was its own separate unit, and later things were added to it to make it a Purim story. And so for that reason, we'll actually end a little bit before the end, because we're going to end with what we believe the original story ended with. One more probably, a lot of times we read the Bible as history, and that is not to say that everything that in the Bible is not historical, but Esther reads more like a folk tale or like a novella than straight history. It's read in the sort of, or it's written in a sort of, you can almost read the beginning as once upon a time. It is, there may be kernels of history in it, but the person who wrote it knew how to tell a good story. And so it's written as that kind of story. Just one last thing before I get started. Every text is a translation because I can't speak Hebrew and you probably don't know Hebrew. And so we had to make decisions about what the story would read like. And so I used a number of sources. Again, we end with the middle of chapter 8. But the sources that I'm using, I listed them on the back for you. I have the books by these particular people, so I'm happy to loan them out if you have questions or you want to know about some of this. I used the Jewish Publication Society's, let's say, official Hebrew text. I used a text from the Kohot Publication Society, which contains information from the rabbis from the time of Jesus forward, who may not know the text, but whose understanding of Hebrew wordplay informs the text. Our NRSV translation is a good translation, but it hides some of that wordplay. It pulls Esther a little bit out of its Persian context. So we'll see at the end, Mordecai does not wear a crown like translations tell us now. He wears a turban, which is, on one hand it feels like a small change. On the other hand, it adds something to the picture of who Mordecai is and where Mordecai is. And so I also used a translation by Michael Fox, who explained how the Hebrew would sound. And so we inserted some of his suggestions in tone. For example, I had a friend who said, in German, it always sounds like somebody is angry. If you don't know German, because of the way the consonants are used in German, as opposed to a language like Portuguese or Spanish. That's not to say that German is bad, but that is a style that is used. Hebrew has a style all its own. So there are places where we tried to capture some of the staccato that happens in Hebrew. Some places where it feels like things were spat out. We tried our best to capture that. So that's my reasoning for using this particular translation. Again, if you have questions, please let me know. I am happy to engage them. So this is not a translation you will find in any of your Christian Bibles, but it's a translation that is faithful to the story itself. as I filibuster to get this thing started.
So I'll have a question.
Yeah.
So do scholars kind of put a time period as to when they think chapters 9 and 10 were added?
We believe that that is most likely in the 100 years after it was written down.
Oh, okay.
That it happened pretty soon after, because a very early question was, what are we going to do about this book? Is it a biblical book or not?
But it was a biblical book in the Jewish side?
Even the Jewish rabbis
Okay.
debated until after the time of Jesus
Okay.
as to whether or not this was a good Jewish book. Purim probably began in Susa, which would explain the use of the book. And so there were a number of rabbis that were, not being from Susa, who felt this was a regional celebration that perhaps wasn't fitting for the Jewish people outside of Susa. And so there was actually a good amount of disagreement. Rabbi Akiva was a very prominent rabbi in the 2nd century, who finally put an end to the question and said, Esther does not defile the hands, which is to say, it's not a lewd or ruckus story. It has, it has spiritual meaning for us. This is too important a book to leave to history. So that's having said that, if there were any Hebrew scholars here, I'm sure they could give you a much longer explanation. Yeah.
So if it was first written down, what'd you say?
In the 4th century,
Fourth
yeah.
century. When do they think historically it occurred? Like when was Queen Xerxes around?
So you could think of it as the introduction is similar to, there are a set of biblical books called the Apocrypha. There is a book in the Apocrypha called Judith, and at the beginning of the story is very similar, but it says, when Nebuchadnezzar sat on his throne in Assyria. And it's very clearly a made-up introduction, because Nebuchadnezzar did not sit on that throne. It was a hint to the audience that this was a folk tale and not something historical. So one of the questions here has been, is this the intention of this author? Because there were 2 Xerxes and an Artaxerxes that all reigned in the same 150 year span of time. And so the question is, was the intention, like Judith, simply to establish a person, or was it one of these 3? And now we're leaning to the kernel of the story probably includes one of these 3, but we can't identify exactly who.
I just find it interesting that Luther found it too Jewish, and the Jewish didn't find it Jewish enough.
That's a very interesting, it's a contradiction. One thing as Lutherans, we read the Bible through, primarily through law and gospel. How does God reveal our sinfulness? How, through Jesus Christ, are we freed from our sinfulness and given God's promise? And so Luther had a really hard time putting that together. But for the Jewish rabbis, it was a different... The Jewish rabbis said, is this really an edifying book? Is it good for us to read? And so both of them would say no, but they're coming at it from the two different angles. That's a great thing to point out. Thank you. All right. So at the bottom of that last page, I just included that picture again of Esther in a different world than we often imagine her. So if there are no more questions, I will read the story of Esther. It happened in the days of Xerxes. This was the same Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, from India to Ethiopia. In those days, in the 3rd year of his reign, when he was sitting on his throne, he gave a feast for all his officials and courtiers, the administrators of Persia and Media, the high aristocracy, and the princes of the provinces in his presence. For no fewer than 180 days he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. And when those days were over, the king gave a feast for 7 days in the courtyard of the garden of the king's pavilion for all the people who lived in the fortress of Susa, high and low alike. And the cloths of white and percaline and violet, bound with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and alabaster pillars. And there were couches of gold and silver on a pavement of marble, alabaster, mother of pearl, and mosaics. Drinks were served in vessels of gold and vessels of other various sorts, and there was royal wine in abundance, as befits a king. The only rule for drinking was that there were no rules, for the king had given orders to the stewards to comply with each man's wishes. Likewise, Queen Vashti gave a feast for women in King Xerxes' palace. On the 7th day, the king was lightheaded with wine. He ordered the 7 eunuchs who attended him, Mehuman, Bezetha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing only the royal diadem. He wanted to show off her beauty to all the people there. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's order. The king became very angry, and his fury burned within him. Then the king consulted the sages who were learned in procedure, for this was the king's custom, to turn to all who were well versed in law and precedent. His closest advisors were the 7 ministers of Persia and Media, Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memacon. They had immediate access to the king and held high positions in the kingdom. What, he asked, should be done to Queen Vashti for refusing to obey the command of Xerxes conveyed by the eunuchs? Then Memacon addressed the king and the people gathered. Queen Vashti has not only offended the king, but also all the officials and all the people in all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's behavior will make all women feel contempt for their husbands. For they will say, King Xerxes commanded that Queen Vashti be brought before him, yet she would not come. This very day, the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will repeat it to all the king's officials, and there will be anger and disgrace. If it please the king, Let a royal declaration proceed from him, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media, never to be revoked, that Vashti shall never enter the presence of King Xerxes. And let your majesty bestow her royal status upon another woman who is more worthy than she. Then your majesty's judgment shall resound throughout the kingdom, vast though it is. And all women will treat their husbands with respect, high and low alike. The idea pleased the king and the officials, and the king did as Memucan advised. Dispatches were sent to all the provinces of the king, to every province in its own script, and every nation in its own language, saying that every man shall be master in his own home, and speak the language of his own people. Sometime later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officials in every province of his kingdom to gather every beautiful young virgin into the harem at the fortress of Susa, under the control of Hegai, the king's eunuch and keeper of the women. Let them be provided with cosmetics, and let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen in place of Vashti." The proposal pleased the king, and he acted upon it. In the fortress of Susa there lived a Jew, a Benjaminite by the name of Mordecai, son of Yair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem, along with King Jehoiachin of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken into exile. Mordecai was foster father to Hadassah, known also as Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. She was beautiful and lovely to look at. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. When the king's order was announced and many girls were assembled in the fortress of Susa under the care of Hegai, Esther too was taken into the king's palace under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women. The girl won his favor, so that he was quick to provide her cosmetics and meals, and to give her the 7 most suitable maids from the palace. He treated her and her maids with special kindness in the harem. Now Esther had not revealed her people or her ancestry, because Mordecai had told her not to reveal it. And every single day Mordecai would stroll in front of the harem courtyard to learn how Esther was faring and what was happening to her. Now when each girl's turn came to go to King Xerxes, after completing the 12 months beauty treatment, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetics, she would go in this manner. Whatever she asked for would be given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. She would go in the evening and leave in the morning, going back to the harem in the charge of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch, keeper of the concubines. She would not go back to the king again unless the king wanted her, when she would be summoned by name. When the time came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, who was the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, told her to take. And so Esther gained the favor of all who saw her. And Esther was taken to King Xerxes in his royal quarters in the 10th month, that is Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his grace and favor more than all the other virgins. He placed a royal diadem on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and courtiers, called the Feast of Esther. He declared relief from taxes for the provinces and gave many gifts, as befits a king. Now, when the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. Esther did not reveal her people or her ancestry, as Mordecai had told her, for Esther obeyed him, as she had done while under his care. At that time, when Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs from the threshold guards, became angry and planned to kill King Xerxes. But Mordecai learned of it and informed Queen Esther. Esther reported it to the king in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated and found to be true, and the two eunuchs were impaled on stakes. The whole matter was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his chair above those of all the other officials. All the king's courtiers in the king's gate would kneel and bow low to Haman, for such was the king's decree. Mordecai, however, would not kneel or bow low. The king's courtiers who were in the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's decree?" When they said this to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would prevail, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or bow low, he was filled with rage. But he thought it was beneath him to strike out at Mordecai alone. Having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, Mordecai's people, who were in Xerxes' entire kingdom. In the first month, that is Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, the pour, which means the lot, was cast in Haman's presence for every day and every month, to destroy the people of Mordecai in one day. And it fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is Adar. Haman then said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people, scattered and dispersed among the other people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not obey the laws of the king. It is not in your majesty's interest to leave them alone. If it please your majesty, let a decree be made that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the officers to be deposited into the royal treasury." The king removed his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, persecutor of the Jews. And the king said, "The money is yours, and the people are yours, to do with as you please." So, on the 13th day of the first month, the king's scribes were summoned, and a decree was issued in accordance with Haman's command to the king's satraps and the governors of every province and the officials of every people, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language. It was written in King Xerxes' name and sealed with his signet ring. Accordingly, written instructions were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, massacre, and exterminate all the Jews, young and old, men, women, and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, and to plunder their possessions. The message of the letter was that the law should be proclaimed in every single province and publicly displayed to all the peoples, so that they should be ready for that day. The couriers hurried out by order of the king, and the decree was proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to feast, and the city of Susa was thrown into turmoil. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and poured ashes on himself. He went throughout the city, crying out loudly and bitterly until he reached the king's gate. You cannot enter the king's gate wearing sackcloth. And in every province where the royal declaration reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, fasting, crying, wailing, and the masses laid in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was filled with dread. She sent a set of clothes to Mordecai so that he would remove his sackcloth, but he refused. After this, Esther summoned Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs appointed to serve her, and sent him to Mordecai to learn what this was all about. Hatak went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and all about the money that Haman had offered to pay the king for the right to destroy the Jews. He also gave him the written text of the royal declaration that was proclaimed in Susa for their destruction. He told him to show it to Esther and to instruct her to go to the king, to appeal to him and to plead with him on behalf of her people. When Hatak delivered the message to Esther, she told him to take her reply. All the aristocracy and the officials of the king's provinces know that if any person enters the king's presence in the royal quarters without being summoned, they will be put to death. The only exception is if the king extends the golden scepter, then they may live, but I have not been summoned to visit the king for 30 days now. When Mordecai was told what Esther had said, he sent another message. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the royal palace. On the contrary, if you keep quiet, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, but you and your family line will die out. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal status for just such a crisis. Then Esther sent back to Mordecai. Go and gather all the Jews who live in Susa and fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days and nights. My maidens and I will observe the same fast. Then I will go to the king, even though I defy the law. If I die, I die. Mordecai went throughout the city and did as Esther had commanded. On the third day, Esther put on royal garments and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal quarters, facing the entrance. It happened that, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she won his favor. The king extended the golden scepter he was holding, and Esther approached and touched the tip. The king said, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther? What is your request? I would grant you even half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "Should it so please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the feast which I have prepared for him." The king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that we do Esther's bidding." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. During the wine course, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It will be granted to you. And what is your request? I would grant you even half of my kingdom." And Esther replied, "My wish and my request. If I have found favor in the king's eyes, and should it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast I shall prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So Haman went out merry and in good spirits. But when he saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and Mordecai did not rise or even stir, Haman was filled with wrath against him. But Haman controlled himself, went home, and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman told them about his great wealth and his many sons, and all the ways in which the king had promoted him and advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. What is more, said Haman, Queen Esther gave a feast, and besides the king, she invited nobody but me. And tomorrow, too, I am invited by her along with the king. Yet, all this means nothing to me, so long as I must see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. And his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a stake made, 75 feet high, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then you can go merrily with the king to the feast. Haman was pleased with the idea, and he had the stake set up. That very night, sleep eluded the king, so he sent for the book of the Chronicles, the records of the palace. As they were being read aloud to the king, it was found written that Mordecai had informed on Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs from the threshold guards, who had plotted to kill King Xerxes. The king asked, what honor and greatness has been conferred on Mordecai for this? The servants replied, nothing at all. Then the king asked, who was out in the courtyard? For Haman had come into the outer courtyard of the palace to tell the king to impale Mordecai on the stake he had put up. The servants answered, it is Haman standing in the courtyard. The king said, let him enter. Haman entered, and the king asked him, what should be done for a man whom the king desires to honor? And Haman thought to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? So Haman said, the man whom the king desires to honor, let royal garments be brought, ones that the king has worn, and a horse, one which the king has ridden, and upon whose head the royal diadem has been placed. And let the garments and the horse be given to one of the king's high aristocrats. Have him dress the man the king desires to honor, and have him set him on the horse in the city square, and have him cry out, this is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor. And the king said to Haman, quickly then, take the garments and the horse, just as you said. Do this for Mordecai the Jew, who sits in the king's gate. Don't neglect a word of all that you have said. So Haman took the garments and the horse, and dressed Mordecai, and set him on the horse in the city square, and cried out before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, and Haman ran home, covering his head with grief. Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is really of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin. While they were still speaking to him, the king's eunuchs arrived and rushed to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman came to drink with Queen Esther. On the second day, during the wine course, the king said to Esther, what is your wish? It will be granted to you. And what is your request? I would grant you even half of my kingdom. Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and should it so please the king, as my wish, may I be granted my life, and as a request, my people. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, massacred, annihilated. If we had only been sold to be slaves, I would have kept silent. I speak because our adversary is not concerned with the king's loss." Then King Xerxes demanded of Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he who had the audacity to do such a thing?" Esther replied, "A man hateful and hostile, this wicked Haman." And Haman cringed in terror before the king and the queen. The king arose in his fury from the wine course and went out to the pavilion garden. Haman stood to beg Queen Esther for his life, for he saw that consequences were close at hand from the king. When the king returned from the pavilion garden to the hall, Haman had fallen across the couch on which Esther was reclining. And the king cried, "Do you also intend to have your way with the queen right here in my palace?" As soon as the words left the king's mouth, Haman covered his face with humiliation. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "What's more, a stake is standing at Haman's house, 75 feet high, which he made for Mordecai, whose words saved the king." The king ordered, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the stake he had made for Mordecai, and the king's fury subsided. That day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the persecutor of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Mordecai was presented to the king, for Esther revealed how he was related to her. The king removed his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's property. Then once again, Esther spoke to the king, falling at his feet and weeping, begging him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king. "If it please the king, and if I have found favor with him, and if the idea seems proper to the king, and if I am pleasing to him, let letters be written overturning the plan of Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, to annihilate the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see the disaster which will befall my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "See, I have given Haman's property to Esther, and he has been impaled on the stake for scheming against the Jews. Now, as for you two, write in the king's name as you please concerning the Jews, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a document written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring cannot be revoked." The royal scribes were summoned at that time, on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, and a decree was issued in accordance with all that Mordecai had commanded the Jews and the satraps and the governors and the officials of the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language. He had them written in King Xerxes' name and sealed with his signet ring. Written instructions were sent by couriers, riders on horseback and riders of speedy camels, to this effect: "The king has permitted the Jews in each and every city to gather and make a stand for their lives, to destroy, massacre, and exterminate the forces of every people and province who afflict them, together with children and women, and to plunder their possessions on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar." A copy of the document was to be issued as a law in every single province and publicly displayed to all the peoples, so that the Jews should be ready for that day to vindicate themselves against their enemies. The couriers, riders on horseback, and riders of speedy camels went out urgently at the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then Mordecai went out from the king's presence in royal clothing of violet and white, in a large gold turban and a cloak of linen and purple. And the city of Susa rejoiced and was merry. And the Jews had light and happiness, joy and glory. And in every single province and in every single city, wherever the king's command and decree arrived, there was happiness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. This ends the story of Esther.
It's interesting. I was following along, and in my version, they've softened it by saying he was hung by gallows versus impaled on a stake.
Impaled on a stake. It's a completely different image.
Oh, yeah. And then 75 feet, which is in both. I mean, that's 7 stories. Right? I mean, that is. Yeah, you can see it from a long ways.
Oh, yes. Any questions or comments or anything before we close for today? We'll have another session at 9:15 next Sunday, and that theme will be, I promise I will talk a lot less, and we will talk a lot more. We're going to talk about the good news of life in exile. I know that doesn't sound like good news right away, but we'll talk about the good news of life in exile.
So do we ever hear what happened on the 13th day of the 12th month? Was there
That is in chapter 9,
okay.
which is considered to be part of the addition to Esther to make it more acceptable to Purim, in which the Jews do in fact massacre their enemies. This was one of the reasons why the early rabbis struggled with this book, because they felt that such a thing was not becoming of the people of God. And so I chose to leave it off, not because I find it distasteful, but because after 817a, the rest of the story contains justification for the feast and its setting and its length and what is to take place. And so scholars think that is what was added in at that point.
I don't want to steal your thunder for next week, but...
No, go for
I
it.
found it pretty interesting as you were reading and you're talking about the good news of exile. And Esther told the king, if you had sold us to slavery, I wouldn't even bother with this. So that's kind of like, slavery's good news.
Better news.
Better news, I guess.
Better news.
Yeah, now that I look at the 75-foot pole,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is one of the things I find so interesting reading the book of Esther is those moments of, that is not laugh out loud funny, but that's almost a ridiculous thing to say, even in the presence of the king. If the king has said, I'll give you half the kingdom, and then you say, well, slavery would have been fine. It's it's a little bit of a comic understatement by Esther. But Esther proves herself to be very savvy in dealing with the king, which is something that I spoke about at the 8 o'clock service, kind of setting the scene, and I'll talk about it at 10:30 too. But the circumstances where the characters find themselves is always very complex. There's a lot more, it's a good story, and one that Jewish synagogues and Jewish gatherings read it every year at Purim, and it is the sort of thing that even children get into. Whenever they hear the name Haman, everybody is supposed to boo. You write Haman's name on your shoes, the underside of your shoes, and you stamp your feet whenever they say his name. You're stamping out Haman's memory. And so there's a level to it where, a 5 or 6 year old will understand what Haman is doing is very wrong, and will understand, will gain that message from the story, the message of redemption. But then for adults, there are so many other layers piled on top of it that you can, and thank goodness Rabbi Akiva said that the Jewish people should keep it, because it is something, like I could stand up here and talk for hours. I'm not going to. But, my wife is pointing to her non-existent watch. All right. Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Very good.
And next week, 9:15, Good News of Life in Exile.